Welcome to the fifth in our series of short videos preparing you for essay writing in Logos 1, and this one is about writing and structuring your body paragraphs. So we acknowledge the traditional owners and custodians of the land upon which our university sits. I used this slide in the earlier presentation on paragraph planning, just to remind you that paragraphs are really the building blocks of essays. In that presentation, I suggested paragraphs of about 5 or 6 sentences, about 150 words. Now, it's possible for you to write longer, and in fact, the example essay which I'm going to use today has paragraphs of actually over 200 words. The principle really is, as I said earlier, to make your life as easy as possible by not trying to write something complicated. A long paragraph can become unwieldy, it can be difficult to control, you can lose the point, etc. And in a way, I'm going to suggest you regard your paragraph as like a little old man. In fact, me, maybe, going for my daily walk. And whenever I see a bench, I sit down, get my breath back, and then get up again, refreshed. And that's what it's like with your paragraphs. They get tired very easily, like a little old man. So don't run them into the ground. Take that opportunity whenever it comes up to take a break and come in refreshed with a new paragraph. There's no prize for writing it as long as you can. Here, anyway, is an example from that essay that I mentioned. And as you can see, it is a bit longer, but a well-structured paragraph and a good example of the kind of essay which you're going to be writing yourself. I will just remind you once again that having seen a good example of an essay on a topic which you are going to write, or maybe you're going to write a similar topic, you have to be careful to avoid the risk of plagiarizing by lifting sentences and ideas from that essay. The idea of giving you the essay is just to show you what a philosophy essay looks like in terms of structure and style. And it's very useful, and that's why I've used it in today's presentation. So, in the body paragraphs, particularly in part 2, where you're developing your argument, you're taking a position, there'll be topic or bridge sentences, which I'll explain in a moment, and then sentences which allow you to develop your argument. For example, conditional propositions. Now, if you don't know what they are, I suggest you have a look in the textbook for Logos 1, and I believe they're covered in chapter 5. I had a look at that myself the other day. Of course, now I'm an expert, and you know, if you want to be a philosophical genius like me, I suggest you have a look yourself, and particularly that chapter is talking about the kinds of philosophical thinking and argument. And together with those, you have explanation and examples to show your understanding of the proposition, which often is a little bit more abstract. Parallel arguments to strengthen, persuade the reader of your point of view. Counter arguments to do the same thing, either to run with the counter argument or to just introduce it and knock it down to give further support for your main one. Assertions of fact to test the propositions that you've been developing. And conclusions. And you may notice that essentially what you've got here in the body paragraph is like a mini essay, because you've got an introduction. Your introduction is your topic or bridge sentence. Then you've got a body, which is the middle parts, and then you've got a conclusion. And in a way, an essay is like a team, and each paragraph is a player. Here's my team, by the way, Albany United. And the important thing in a team is that each player is a kind of complete player in themselves, but they also play for the team. And that's, I think, how you can regard your paragraphs, you know. The paragraph needs to be a complete player, needs its own kind of introduction sentence, body and conclusion sentence. And then it needs to be playing for the team. It needs to be relevant and moving your argument forward. So, let's begin with the topic sentence, which is one way to begin a paragraph. Here's an example from that essay. And a topic sentence is actually made up of two elements. The first element is simply naming the topic of the new paragraph. Okay, so in this case, the new paragraph is about the argument from moral progress. And then the rest of the sentence makes a claim about that. So in this case, the claim is that it follows this logic, and the next sentence goes on to tell the reader what that logic is. Okay, so you have the topic named and then a claim about the topic, and that's what makes a complete topic sentence. And here's another example. So here the topic is, again, this is the first sentence from another paragraph. The topic is moral principles in subjectivism. And what claim does the student make? That these are the product of the subject. And then the rest of the paragraph explains what that means and what the implications are for whether it's going to be a credible ethical position. Okay, now another way to start a paragraph is with a bridge sentence, which adds on another element before the topic sentence to make a bridge. And that other element is looking back at the topic of the previous paragraph. Here's an example from the same essay. In this case, the first half of the essay is looking back to the topic of the previous paragraph, which was the argument about subjectivism, SB. And then the topic of the new paragraph comes in the second half of that sentence. And putting them together like that makes a kind of bridge for the reader so that they can walk across from the topic of the previous paragraph to the new one, and they don't kind of fall down into the gap between them. So it creates flow, and I would recommend you to consider making some of them. You don't need necessarily to do it all in one sentence. It could be two sentences. The first sentence looking back, the second sentence looking forward. And here's another example from a different paragraph in the same essay. Here, the first sentence looks back at arguments from the previous 2 or 3 paragraphs. And notice the student says, analysis has demonstrated before. So has demonstrated, it's called the present perfect tense in English, and it's a way of talking about what you've already done. And then, as you can see, the next sentence moves us forward to the topic of the new paragraph. And essentially the student is saying, kind of, having got rid of those points of view, I'm now going to present the point of view which I actually support. So it can be quite a good, I think, convincing form of argument to deal with the things you don't agree with and show the weakness is there, and then introduce your alternative and show why your alternative is more credible. It addresses those weaknesses. Anyway, have a look at the whole essay and you'll see what I mean. So there are any number of these in the example essay. If X, blah, blah, blah. Okay, and so that's the beginning, that's pretty near the beginning of that paragraph about moral realism. And again, the strategy the student is using is to imagine that this is actually wrong. The student doesn't think it's wrong at all. The student believes in it. But first, the student's going to imagine that it's wrong and then follow that to its logical conclusion. How it develops then, through explanation. So that phrase, put simply, gives the reader the idea that this is not a new point. This is just an explanation of the sentence before in a more familiar way. A similar thing happens with introducing examples. Both of those strategies are ways of showing that you, the writer, understand what you've said, and they certainly help the reader to understand. And similarly, counter arguments, in this case with however, parallel arguments with similarly, both ways of developing the argument to take it along to its logical conclusion. Okay, we've got another conditional proposition. There are many of them. What I think the student then cleverly does is to run those conditional propositions, those kind of hypotheses, imaginary statements, up against a brick wall of fact. Bam! He smashes them. And then it makes for a very clear conclusion. So you can see that the assertion of fact, the language is very clear. In society we do. There's no if it were we would, which is the language of speculation and conditional proposition. Here it switches over to the language of fact, and there's that contrast. And the conclusion is very clear. It's the last sentence in the paragraph, and the word therefore makes it very clear that this is a conclusion. So you don't need to use linking words all the time, but they are useful at important parts in your paragraph to let the reader know what is going on. Okay, so you may be comparing, in fact you're required to compare ideas and theories on the same topic. Certainly in 3 of the topics, that's a requirement of the question. So, like, unlike, those are very economical, straightforward ways of comparing two theories or principles, for example. And there are examples in the essay that you've been given. Ways of introducing explanation. I think in the example we saw put simply, but I think in other words this means that are probably more common, and there are examples in other paragraphs in that essay too. Yes, for example, for instance, adding examples. Those three phrases are very common. Notice that they're quite strong phrases, so they often begin a sentence and then they're often followed by a comma and then the rest of the sentence, and that's because they're such strong sentence words. So when you say them, you'd say moreover or furthermore. Okay, that's what the comma is there for. And parallel arguments we saw similarly in that paragraph. Likewise is another way of doing it. We saw however, which is probably the most common way of introducing a counter argument, one of my favorite words. And conclusion words, there are several. Therefore is certainly the most common. There are a couple of other examples that you could use too. So that's really just a brief bit of information about writing your body paragraphs and structure and elements and style. So if you want to look at another one of these, the next one in the series is writing your conclusion paragraph. So maybe I'll see you there, and please do take the chance at least once to fill in our survey to give us an idea about whether these were useful or not. It'll only take you a minute.